Hey guys, and welcome to another IndieTips.com tutorial, daily notebook-friendly filmmaking tips over at IndieTips.com. I've had a few comments on previous videos asking, can I put up a tutorial explaining Premiere Pro? And I've kind of forgot that a good amount of people who come to this channel aren't just looking for DSLR info, but are quite new to filmmaking as a whole. So here we are with an in-depth tutorial. I always say that on every tutorial, but this one is pretty in-depth. It's the longest video I've ever put out. And we will be covering the whole basics of Premiere Pro to get you set up from day one. In the description box, there will be clickable links to take you to certain sections of the video if you are looking for something specific. And as always with these videos, they will have better audio than any other tutorial on YouTube. I'm only joking. And the settings and preferences will be my own personal preferences, ones that I find more convenient than the standard settings. Now, we're not going to go in and look how to do each and every effect. This is just going to be a run through of Premiere Pro as a whole. So when you first load up Premiere Pro, you're presented with this new project pop-up box with two panels. You can go from general and scratch discs. You can leave everything in the general panel as it is, considering only 3 people in the world still use DV and everyone imports digital footage from a memory card. We can leave this alone. Now click over onto the scratch disk panel. Now when you edit a project, Premiere Pro uses disk space to store files required by your project. Premiere Pro stores captured video and audio, conformed audio and preview files. This is to optimize performance, allowing real-time editing. So when you're playing back your clip and it's playing in real time, the file in some sense has already been pre-rendered by Premiere Pro to allow this. And this file is stored in the scratch disk. It is recommended having a different scratch disk on a different drive for each medium. So my main hard drive is C, and then for all of the other mediums, audio and visual, I'll have them saved on a separate hard drive. It would be more convenient to have a different hard drive for each medium, but if you only have one hard drive, then leave it on the default setting. However, I do recommend investing in another. So name your project and press OK. We're then presented with the new sequence box. Here you get to choose what settings you require for your project. Now there's a slight glitch with Premiere Pro CS6, so I'm not sure if it has been fixed, but sometimes all of the presets are actually missing. If you used CS5.5 or CS5, you were presented with DSLR presets, red presets, and Adobe have said just to do a fresh install, this should appear as likely that they have got too drunk and ended up near the After Effects home. I have way too many plugins to do a clean refresh, so I just have a little cheat that takes no time away from my editing project. In fact, it may speed up the process, but we'll talk about that a little later. Again, we'll leave everything else as it is. Select the preset as you require. If your one isn't on the list, don't worry, we can do the cheat in a minute. So click OK. And here we are. After 500 words, we're in the flight room. This will be your new home, but before we start messing around, let's just sort out some of the internals. So go over to Edit and scroll down to Preferences. Now these settings are going to help the computer's optimization as well as your own. First I'll go to Appearance, and I'm going to ramp up the lightness right the way up. One, because a lot of films I work with are usually pretty dark, and sometimes it can get hard distinguishing the film to the background of Premiere Pro. And secondly, because when editing, even though you are sitting in your chair, it can be a mentally tiring thing, and having a nice dark backdrop in the night time when the lights are off, it can be pleasing to the eye, and you're going to get tired very quickly and you're going to end up falling asleep. With the light backdrop, it's in your face, the color scheme isn't all that great, it doesn't really look nice, but it keeps you on your feet. Next, go down to autosave, and you're going to save automatically every 15 minutes. For this, I'm going to unselect it just so it doesn't interrupt the tutorial. Next, go down to Media, and when Premiere Pro imports audio and video in some formats, it processes and caches versions of these items that it can readily access when generating previews. A database retains links to each of the cached media files. This media cache database is shared with Adobe Media Encoder, After Effects, Encore, and Soundbooth. So each of these applications can be read from and write to in the same set of cached media files. If you change the location of the database from within any of these applications, the location is updated for the other applications too. Each application can use its own cache folder, but the same database keeps track of them. Again, I would suggest to move them on a separate hard drive. Next, go down to memory, and you want to use as much RAM as you can and optimize it for performance. Then click OK. There are 4 main panels. Your source monitor, where you can preview clips and select the desired length before bringing them onto the timeline. In the source monitor area, there is also the effect controls, the audio mixing controls, and the metadata panel. The next window is your program monitor. This is going to display the footage which is in the process of being edited on your timeline. Directly below it is that timeline. This is where you will be cutting all of your footage. And finally, we have the project panel. This is going to harbor all of your footage, audio, and other mediums such as JPEG, as well as housing your sequences. Like the source monitor, this also has extra panels. We have a media browser, which is an in-house browsing system, the info panel, the effects, and markers. So that is our workspace. It is completely customizable. You can change it to how you see fit. You can go up to the window panel, select a number of preset workspaces. For now, we will keep it at this setting, and if you ever want to return to the default, just select Reset Workspace. So let's bring in some footage. You can click File, Import. You can go to your desktop or folder and directly drag the item onto your timeline or into the project window. Or on the project window, you can double click and select your file from its location. So the file has been imported. If you haven't given it a name already, now would be the best time to do so, as if you're going to be importing a lot of clips, it'll soon enough start to get messy. We'll just rename this Cress. And as a side note, in CS6 you're able to hover scroll above the file, allowing you to preview it before you add it to your timeline or source monitor. So double click on the file and it brings the clip up on the source monitor. Here you can preview the clip, edit the clip to the appropriate length you want it to be. You can do this by scrubbing through the clip, find your input point, and on the keyboard select I. Find where you want the clip to end and press O on the keyboard for mark out. You can then either drag the footage onto your timeline, press the insert button, or press the comma on your keyboard. However, I rarely ever use the source monitor. This is probably the second time I've ever used it. I'm more of a drag it in from the project window and sort it out from there. This is the cheat I was talking about, the shortcut. If you couldn't select the exact preset, when you drag in the footage, it will give you the option to correct the settings based off that footage. So go ahead and click change settings. Now your footage is in the timeline, but before we move on, we're just going to stop and change something else. If you rest your hands on the keyboard for a second, you'll find your middle finger on the left hand rests on the letter S. If it doesn't, you haven't learned how to type properly. But it's easier to press S than it is C. It's a ridiculously small movement from S to C, and it's likely you'll be pressing C with your index finger anyway. But it's a movement we can cut out and make our editing process a lot more fluid. So go to Edit and select Keyboard Shortcuts. You want to scroll all the way down until you get to the razor tool. Now this is the tool that you'll be using to cut your footage, and quite rightly so, the default is set as C for cut. Click the layer and enter S for slice. S originally belonged to Snap, so go to Snap and replace that with C, and we'll call that C for clamp. We are also going to be changing the work area keyboard shortcuts to mimic that of After Effects. So if we type in work area, B for the beginning, N for the end, and then we are going to have to go and correct the ripple edit and rolling edit, as these were the original hosts of B and N. Now your editing process will be a lot more fluid. So let's have a look at our timeline window. We have our clip, which can be scrubbed through. I prefer editing the clip on the timeline rather than the source monitor. I just do find it easier. But do what you feel comfortable with. You have 3 video tracks and 3 audio tracks. You can add more by right-clicking above the track area and clicking Add Tracks. This then brings up a pop-up window, and you can do as you please from there. You can't move the tracks, but you can move the footage from track to track. Same with the audio. You can open up a track, and this displays extra settings such as how you want your footage on this one track to appear. Personally, I like to show all frames, and you can adjust your keyframes, which is something we'll talk about in a few minutes. You may notice some tracks are highlighted. These are activated tracks. If you were to copy and paste a piece of media, it would appear on the selected track. To do this, all you do is click the track. Eye icon, or likewise the speaker icon, disables the whole track. The next icon is to toggle the sync lock on and off. In a typical editing project, you will have multiple layers of video clips. When you edit a sequence by doing ripple edits or inserts, you'll want all of the video tracks to stay in sync. This means if one track moves, all the other tracks move the same amount. However, sometimes you may want one track not to move, so disable or enable this function to your tailored use. And to this day, I've still never used this function, so just keep it as it is. Finally, we have the lock layer function. This will keep the layer from being touched. You can't splice, you can't move the footage, nothing. Very useful if you have a really complex scene with lots of cuts. Above the tracks, we have 3 more icons. Snap, which is the function we are now calling clamp because we swapped the shortcut around. This is very useful, and it clamps your footage directly onto the end of the previous shot. If I drag this shot, and when I move it near the other shot, it automatically clamps itself into its brother's arms. If we remove it, you can place the shot where you like with no clamping. The icon with the DVD sets a marker for a chapter start point if the final DVD you're creating is with Adobe Encore. You know when you're watching a DVD and you can skip chapters, this creates that function. And finally, a marker. Markers indicate important points in time and help you position and arrange clips. You can use the marker to identify an important action or a sound in a sequence or a clip. Markers are for reference only and do not alter the video. And what's really cool about this is if you have a separate guy working on visual effects, and let's be honest, every indie filmmaker does everything themselves, so there is no other guy, but for argument's sake, there is in this instance. And for argument's sake again, we're going to imagine that there's a boom pole that appears in this specific frame. I can add a marker, then double click it. I can then say, hey Dave, can you clean the boom pole from this, or whatever. And then when Dave imports the sequence into After Effects, this mark will appear on his timeline with the instructions. You don't have to ring him, you don't have to email him, you get to spend more time on the Xbox or on the PC illegally downloading everything. On the right we have a simplified audio monitoring meter. For reference, it's best to try and keep your audio at -6 dB. At the very top we have our time ruler numbers and our time code. You may notice that the decimal numbers only go up to 23 before counting as a second, and that's because we are working at 24 frames a second. Underneath we have the work area, which is represented by this bar. We can move it, we can extend it. Using B and N, the shortcuts we changed earlier, we can do the same, but from the keyboard. And you may notice underneath the work area, this section is yellow. This means to preview the clip in real time, you do not have to render it. However, if we make some adjustments, say we take the pen tool and we give it a fade in, you'll notice the section has become red, and this requires you to render the footage to play it back in real time. If you have a super duper computer, I'm sure you'll be fine anyway, but if you don't, you can render this section by hitting enter on your keyboard, or by going to sequence, render work area. You'll then notice that the section has turned green, meaning the effect's in place, and you can now play the file again in real time. At the bottom of this section we have our scroll bar, and when I first purchased CS6 I was completely confused because back in CS5 you had these little mountain icons quite like the one in the project window. Well, now with this, all you have to do is to zoom into your file is to take the scroll bar at the bottom, click on the ends and drag it in or out. And now you can make your minor adjustments to your footage. And to quickly pop out into full view again, press the backwards slash. If you right click onto your footage, you have your standard settings such as rename and properties. But there's a few important elements here. First, the unlink option. When you import your footage, if it has sound, it will appear in sync, connected with each other. However, you may want to replace that sound with audio from a professional mic, or you need to overlay a different audio file, but you want to keep the footage. And if you were to cut the audio file as it is, the visual also gets cut too. So click unlink, and you are able to separate the audio from the visual. Another useful option is the speed and duration. You may rightly think so that the option to reverse footage would be in the effects folder. It's not, it's in here. So now we can reverse our footage, and you'll notice that the work area has gone red again. So we will have to re-render. Finally, moving on from our timeline, we can move on to the tools. We won't go into details about the 4 obvious ones, which are the pointer, which is used to highlight specific areas or drag individual files. The splice tool, which cuts footage wherever you make the cut to. The hand, which drags the timeline. The zoom, which obviously zooms. The more complicated tools are the pen, which, as you've seen me do earlier, allows you to adjust certain aspects of the footage file, in this case the opacity. If we were to open the audio, we can increase or decrease the volume. Then we have the slip and slides tool. A slip edit shifts a clip in and out points forward or backward by the same number of frames in a single action. By dragging the slip tool, you can change a clip starting and ending frames without changing its duration or affecting adjacent clips. A slide edit shifts a clip in time, trimming adjacent clips to compensate for the move. As you drag a clip left or right with the slide tool, the out point of the preceding clip and the in point of the following clip are trimmed by the number of frames you move the clip. I very rarely use the slip and slide, it sounds more like a sex position. The rate stretch allows you to slow down or speed up your footage, and the roll and edit and ripple edit tool. Again, these are two tools that I rarely ever use. A roll and edit trims an adjacent out point and in point simultaneously at the same number of frames. This action effectively moves the edit point between clips, preserving clips positions in time and maintaining the total duration of the sequence. A ripple edit trims a clip and shifts its neighboring clip in the track by the amount you trim. It's most likely the 3 most popular tools you'll be using is the selection tool, V on the keyboard, the slice tool, S or C on the keyboard, and the pen tool, P on the keyboard. So make sure you learn those keyboard shortcuts, are they going to speed up your process if you know them. If you're working on a large project, it may be best to expand the entire timeline selection. So let's move on to the project window. This is going to be the home of your media. So let's import some more files. We'll have free audio files, free visual files. If you want to zoom in or out, you do this by using the mountain icons. If you prefer working with lists, you also have the option to switch to that view mode. We can also create folders or bins to organize our footage. If you click the new bin icon as such. And now we have an organized project. And if you click those folders, they pop out in the window, displaying the current content, which also allows you to hover scroll again. The square icon that looks like it's paper flipping over presents you with the option to create new items. You can create a solid color from this list, bars and tones, and even titles if you don't have Photoshop or After Effects available to you. And finally, in this window, we have the automate to sequence. It takes the highlighted footage and places it in the sequence in the order specified. If you shot in order, this can be very useful. So in the other panels, we have our media browser. This is an in-house browsing system, and it allows you to browse your entire computer system without having to leave Premiere. I'm able to directly drag footage from foreign folders onto my timeline, and Premiere will automatically add it to the project folder. The info, as you guessed it, gives you information about your current selected clip. Now the effects panel. Here we have a selection of different effects we can apply to our footage, and at the top there are 3 icons. The first one is accelerated effects. Some effects can take advantage of the processing power of certified graphics cards to accelerate rendering. The second is 32-bit effects. Premiere Pro includes some video effects and transitions that support high bit depth processing. When applied to high bit depth assets such as 16 per bit channel Photoshop files, these effects can be rendered with 32-bit pixels. If you're working with DSLR footage, then you don't really need to worry about this. And then finally, the YUV effects. A quote from the internet explains what these YUV effects are. When effects are used on a video frame, sometimes the effect needs to convert the values back to RGB, red, green, blue, before the effect can be applied. In 8-bit or 16-bit per channel color space, there can potentially be rounding errors when performing this calculation. This can mean situations where pixels that should pass through an effect and change will in fact change in an unwanted way. Effects in Premiere Pro that have the YUV logo do the processing directly on the YUV values without converting them to RGB first. At no point are the pixel values converted to RGB, and you won't see any unwanted color shifting. We have 5 categories to choose effects from. So for example, we're going to go in to video effects, stylize, and we'll choose mosaic. Now to add this to the clip, you can either drag it onto your selected clip, or if the clip is highlighted, then double click the effect. Now it's given the footage a mosaic type feel. You could probably take this somewhere to look digitalized. Now before we move on to the effects controls, let's just finish off this panel and have a look at the markers. Here we can see the markers that are applied to our clip. We can adjust them from this panel, add extra information, even edit the in and out point. Then finally we have the history. Instead of having to Control C to undo everything, you can find where you took the wrong path from this history section. So let's jump up to the source monitor, and as we are on effects already, let's just jump into the control panel for the effects. Here we can adjust the effects that are displayed on our video and audio. If those two are unlinked, then you'll have to select the audio and visually separately to adjust them at different times. So for the time being, we turn the mosaic effect off, and you do this by clicking the FX logo. Let's have a look at the basic effects that are applied to any clip that is dropped into Premiere. We have motion, opacity, and time remapping. If you click the black triangles, it will display a sub-menu, and here we can individually tweak the settings for any effect, whether it's scale, motion, or anything. Now what you may notice is this little section, and we'll call this the keyframe highway. Here are where the keyframes from any effect appear. If you remember when we made that footage earlier fade in, we used the pen tool, and we created 2 points. These were keyframes. A keyframe in animation and filmmaking is a drawing that defines the starting and ending points of any smooth transition. So what we can do here is come into this panel and manually adjust the keyframes with better precision. As I move these, you may notice the keyframes moving along the footage in the timeline layer. And if you right click the keyframe, another set of options appear where you can adjust the keyframe type. You have linear, Bezier, auto Bezier, continuous Bezier, hold, ease in and ease out. Linear creates a uniform change between keyframes. Bezier lets you manually adjust the shape of the graph and the rate of change on either side of a keyframe. You can create very smooth changes using this method. Auto Bezier creates smooth rate changes through a keyframe. As you change the keyframe's value, the Auto Bezier directions handles change to maintain a smooth transition between keyframes. Continuous Bezier creates a smooth rate of change through a keyframe. However, unlike the Auto Bezier method, Continuous Bezier lets you adjust direction handles manually. As you change the shape of the graph on one side of a keyframe, the shape of the other side of the keyframe changes to maintain a smooth transition. And I'm almost certain I've said Bezier wrong on every occasion. We have Hold, which changes the property value without gradual transition. Ease In slows down the value changes entering a keyframe. And Ease Out gradually accelerates the value changes leaving a keyframe. Now you can play around with these effects all day, creating different styles and animations. That is going to be your job. Here's the audio mixer. We have separate mixers for each track, then a master track to control the volume of the entire project. So we'll take the pieces of footage we've already imported, some dialogue, ambience, and a soundtrack. If I press play, you can see the sounds are now being monitored by the mixing channels. Obviously, they're not correctly mixed at the moment. Let's have a look at the different options available to us in this window. If we put the triangle down, it displays an effects panel, and unlike the method where you can drag an audio effect onto a selected clip, this will affect the entire track. Then this drop down menu, we are presented with mixing options. We have Off, which ignores any of the automation parameters for that track. Read processes automation data for all parameters of the track during playback. Each parameter that contains automation data is adjusted to match that data. Write overwrites any existing automation data under the playback cursor unless that automation lane has been made safe during write. For example, you have manually clicked some mute and on and off points in write mode. Attempt to record some volume fades. Latch does not overwrite any existing automation until you make a change to the parameter, at which point it latches on to the new value until you make additional changes or stop playback. Upon stopping playback, it writes a final node and draws the envelope between that point and the pre-existing node. If no pre-existing node exists, the parameter remains at this level for the rest of the session. Touch does not overwrite any existing automation data until you make a change to the parameter, at which point it gradually moves back to the level it was before the change was made. So let's have a look at how useful this touch function can be. So I'm just going to go in here and I'm going to manually adjust the volume so it gets really loud at a certain point. Now using the touch function, I'm able to control the sound without having to go into the individual audio file, and you can see the slider moving up and down. Below the drop down menus we have MSR, M for mute, this mutes that one track, S for solo, which only plays the audio from this track, and R for record. For this you'll have to have a designated input channel for your audio hardware, e.g. a microphone. You can go to your preferences, audio to sort that out. However, if you are recording into a computer, I would suggest that you use a dedicated audio software. So on this panel now we have the metadata. Metadata is a set of descriptive information about a file, video and audio files. Automatically include basic metadata properties such as date, duration and file type. You can add more details with properties such as location, director, copyright and much more. With the metadata panel you can share this information about assets throughout Adobe video and audio applications. Unlike conventional clip properties, which are limited to only applications, projects or final panel, if you're just shooting family films, test footage and short test films, you know, there's not really any point in messing around. Until you start shooting logistically challenging films, you can leave this aside. And finally, for this panel, let's look at the source monitor. But as we look at the source monitor, we will also look at the program monitor at the same time, as bar a few differences such as checking the file's properties and renaming the file in the source monitor window, they essentially can do the same thing. Starting from the left, we have a drop down menu that controls the size of your video. The two icons in the middle, if they are bold, they represent that the visual and audio are present, and the right drop down box allows us to display footage at different qualities. If your computer isn't that powerful, and if you're just starting out at editing, I'll take a stab in the dark and guess your computer is just okay, then you may have some trouble playing back your footage. To fix that, just lower the resolution quality. The icons below are pretty self-explanatory. The marker, which we have discussed, mark in and out, go to start and end, one frame forward, one frame back, play, insert, and overwrite. If you made any adjustments to your clip in the source monitor, it will overwrite what you have already placed in the timeline. And the camera button takes a picture in a variety of formats, which if you're making uploads to YouTube can come in handy, as you can upload a nice still image of your video rather than having YouTube's dodgy automated thumbnail. Now click the spanner or wrench if you are a US viewer, and you have the options to adjust what you are viewing in the monitor. Your color profiles, you can flip through the RGB parade and waveform. If you're interested in how to operate these, I have 2 tutorials on color correcting and grading on the channel. And like the resolution quality for playback, you can also adjust the quality for the paused still. And half quality for the video, it would be best to turn the quality of the paused image to the same setting. Now remember, you will have to switch this setting over on the program monitor too. Then we have safe margins to work with. Again, unless you're working with material that will be broadcasted, you don't really need to worry about these. And finally, if we go into File, Export, here we have a menu and settings to export our footage. I also have another tutorial on the channel covering this topic in extreme detail, going over bit rates and other settings, so check that out too. So that is essentially the fundamental basics of Adobe Premiere Pro. You should now know all aspects and parameters of the window, what you're working with, how to change certain parameters. Have fun messing around with those effects. I hope I have helped you and you go on to edit some fantastic pieces of footage. If you want to return some gratitude and you feel like subscribing isn't enough, I have a project which is always in need of backers. We've had 190 so far, and if you want to be part of that project and receive some great rewards, follow the link on screen or in the description. So this has been a IndieTips.com tutorial. Go check that site out for daily notebook friendly filmmaking tips. Catch you soon.